Imagine stepping off a transport ship after months of brutal warfare, expecting punishment, hunger, and cruelty, only to be handed a bowl of cold, sweet ice cream on your first day as a prisoner. For thousands of German soldiers captured during World War II, this moment seemed like a dream, a trick, or perhaps evidence they had died and gone to some strange version of heaven. These battle-hardened warriors who had survived the freezing Russian front, the scorching deserts of North Africa, and the relentless Allied bombings across Europe could not comprehend what their eyes were seeing and their tongues were tasting. Ice cream served daily, sometimes twice a day, in a prisoner of war camp. The disbelief on their faces told a story that went far beyond food. It revealed the massive gap between two worlds, two philosophies, and two entirely different approaches to warfare and human dignity. This is the remarkable, almost unbelievable story of how American abundance shocked German prisoners, challenged their understanding of their enemy, and ultimately helped reshape their view of the world they thought they knew. The year was 1943, and the tide of war was turning decisively against Nazi Germany. Allied forces had secured North Africa, invaded Sicily, and were preparing for the long push through Italy and eventually into France. With each battle, more German soldiers found themselves overwhelmed by superior numbers, firepower, and resources. Surrender, once considered the ultimate shame in Nazi military culture, became increasingly common as soldiers realized that continued resistance meant certain death. These men, trained to believe they were fighting for the survival of their nation and race, were told horrifying stories about what would happen if they fell into enemy hands. Nazi propaganda painted American soldiers as barbaric gangsters who would torture and execute prisoners without mercy. British captors, they were warned, would be only slightly better. Soviet captors were described as subhuman monsters who would commit unspeakable atrocities. Given this indoctrination, the moment of capture filled every German soldier with terror. They expected the worst. They prepared for beatings, starvation, and possible execution. What they encountered instead would shake the very foundation of everything they had been taught. The experience of capture varied dramatically depending on where and when a German soldier surrendered. Those taken prisoner in North Africa often surrendered to British or American forces after days of fighting in impossible heat with dwindling supplies. Men of the Afrika Korps, once proud soldiers of Rommel's legendary Desert Army, found themselves surrounded, outnumbered, and out of options. The moment they raised their hands in surrender, they braced for violence. Instead, they were quickly disarmed, given water, and treated with what seemed like casual indifference to their presence. There were no beatings, no screaming guards, no immediate executions. Allied soldiers, many of whom were barely older than teenagers themselves, simply processed the prisoners with an efficiency that suggested this was just another task to complete. For many Germans, this first moment of confused relief would only deepen as their captivity continued. Those captured in Italy or later in France and Germany itself often came from units that had fought desperately against overwhelming odds. These were men who had witnessed the full brutality of modern warfare, who had seen their friends blown apart by artillery, incinerated by flamethrowers, or crushed under tank treads. Many were wounded when they surrendered, expecting their injuries to be ignored or their suffering prolonged intentionally. Instead, American medics treated German wounded with the same urgency and care they gave their own soldiers. Morphine was administered, wounds were bandaged, and men who expected to die from their injuries found themselves being carried to field hospitals. The cognitive dissonance was profound. These Americans, whom they had been taught were their racial and cultural inferiors, were saving their lives. The contradiction gnawed at their understanding of the world. After initial capture, German POWs were typically moved to temporary holding areas behind the front lines. Here, the contrast between Nazi ideology and American reality became even more apparent. Prisoners were given food, often their first real meal in days or weeks. It was not gourmet cuisine, but it was hot, plentiful, and safe to eat. Soldiers who had been surviving on meager rations or eating whatever they could scavenge found themselves eating regularly for the first time in months. Guards, while watchful, were not cruel. There were rules, certainly, but not the random violence and degradation that German guards routinely inflicted on prisoners from the East. As days passed and prisoners moved further from the front lines, they began to whisper among themselves. Something was very different about these Americans, something they had not been prepared for German soldiers captured in Europe or North Africa. The next phase of their captivity involved a journey they never imagined they would take. They were going to America. Loaded onto ships by the thousands, these men crossed the Atlantic Ocean, that vast barrier between the old world and the new. The voyage itself was surreal. Packed into the holds of transport ships, they had time to think, to talk, to question everything they thought they knew. The Nazi propaganda machine had described America as a weak, decadent nation torn apart by racial conflict and economic inequality, a mongrel society without true culture or strength. Yet this supposedly weak nation had built an armada of ships, an ocean of steel that now carried Germany's soldiers to an uncertain fate. The irony was not lost on the more thoughtful prisoners. The conditions aboard ship were crowded but not intentionally cruel. Prisoners received regular meals, had access to latrines, and were allowed on deck for fresh air in supervised shifts. Many Germans had never seen the ocean before, let alone crossed it. The sheer scale of the Atlantic impressed and intimidated them. The voyage typically took between 10 and 14 days, depending on the route and weather conditions. During this time, rumors spread wildly among the prisoners. Some believed they were being taken to America to work as slave labor in mines or factories. Others feared they would be used as test subjects for medical experiments or simply dumped in the ocean once they were far from witnesses. The most optimistic hoped for prisoner camps similar to what they had heard existed in Canada or the American Midwest, places where they might simply wait out the war in safety. None of them, not even the most optimistic, imagined what actually awaited them. As the ships approached American shores, prisoners were brought on deck to catch their first glimpse of their destination. Those who arrived in New York Harbor saw the Statue of Liberty, that iconic symbol of freedom and opportunity that had greeted millions of immigrants seeking a better life. The irony struck many of them. They were arriving not as willing immigrants but as defeated enemies, yet they felt safer than they had in years. The New York skyline with its towering skyscrapers presented a vision of wealth and power that contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had told them. This was not a failing nation. This was not a weak society. The sheer scale of American cities, visible even from the harbor, suggested resources and organizational capacity beyond anything they had imagined. As they disembarked and were loaded onto trains for transport to interior camps, the journey continued to challenge their preconceptions. The American landscape, vast and varied, rolled past their windows. Towns, farms, factories, all seemingly untouched by war. There were no bombed-out buildings, no desperate civilians, no signs of the suffering that had become normal in Europe. The prisoners were entering a different world. The American government established hundreds of prisoner-of-war camps across the country, many in rural areas far from major cities. These camps were built quickly but solidly, designed to house prisoners humanely while keeping them secure. When German POWs arrived at these camps, they stepped off trains or trucks expecting barbed wire, guard towers, and brutal conditions. They found all of those security features, certainly, but what happened next shocked them to their core. They were processed, given clean uniforms, assigned to barracks that, while simple, were clean and weatherproof, and then taken to the mess hall. And that is where the ice cream appeared. For many German soldiers, this first meal in an American POW camp became a moment they would remember for the rest of their lives. The mess halls were large, clean, and organized. Prisoners lined up with trays, cafeteria style, and moved through a serving line where American soldiers or sometimes other prisoners working kitchen duty loaded their trays with food. And what food it was! Portions were generous, sometimes shockingly so. There was meat, vegetables, bread, and often coffee or milk to drink. The quality exceeded what many of these men had eaten even before the war, during the Depression years in Germany. But the ice cream, that cold, sweet, creamy dessert, became the symbol of everything that bewildered them. It was not served occasionally as a special treat. It was there every day, sometimes multiple times per day. In a world at war, in a camp holding enemy soldiers, the Americans were serving ice cream. The Geneva Convention, which governed the treatment of prisoners of war, required that POWs be fed rations equivalent to what the captor nation's soldiers received. America, with its vast agricultural capacity and industrial food production, fed its soldiers well. This meant that German POWs, by treaty obligation, also ate well. But the abundance went beyond mere compliance with international law. It reflected something fundamental about American culture and resources. The United States had not been invaded, its farms were producing record harvests, and its factories were running at full capacity. While Europe starved and suffered, America had food to spare. The decision to feed prisoners well was partly practical. Healthy prisoners could work more effectively, but it also reflected American values about human dignity and the proper conduct of civilized nations. For the Germans, who came from a system that routinely starved and worked to death prisoners it deemed inferior, this treatment was incomprehensible. Life in American POW camps quickly settled into a predictable routine that further challenged German expectations. Prisoners woke to a morning bell, attended roll call, ate breakfast, and then either worked at assigned tasks or attended recreational activities. The work varied depending on the camp's location. Some prisoners worked on nearby farms, helping with harvests that American farmers could not complete alone due to labor shortages. Others worked in camp maintenance, keeping the facilities clean and functional. Some camps had workshops where prisoners with skills could work as carpenters, mechanics, or craftsmen. The work was supervised but not forced at gunpoint. Prisoners who worked received small wages in camp scrip that they could use at the camp canteen to buy small luxuries like cigarettes, candy, or toiletries. The food, however, remained the constant topic of conversation and disbelief. 3 meals a day every day, with quantities that seemed wasteful to men who had grown accustomed to hunger. Breakfast might include oatmeal or eggs, bacon, toast, and coffee. Lunch offered sandwiches, soup, and fruit. Dinner featured meat, potatoes or rice, vegetables, bread, and dessert. And yes, ice cream appeared frequently, sometimes as the dessert at dinner, sometimes as an afternoon treat, sometimes both. American ice cream production during the war was actually a point of military priority. The military believed that ice cream boosted morale, and floating ice cream barges were even sent to the Pacific Theater to serve sailors and soldiers. If American troops were eating ice cream regularly, then POWs under Geneva Convention requirements would eat it too. Beyond food, the camps offered amenities that seemed surreal given the circumstances. Many camps had libraries stocked with books in German athletic fields where prisoners could play soccer or other sports, and spaces for artistic or musical activities. Prisoners could form bands, stage plays, or create art. Mail from home was allowed, though heavily censored and irregular given the chaos in Germany. Red Cross packages supplemented camp supplies. Prisoners could attend religious services, Catholic or Protestant depending on their faith. Medical care was available, with camp doctors treating everything from minor injuries to serious illnesses. Men who had expected degradation and cruelty instead found themselves living more comfortably than they had during much of the war, and in many cases more comfortably than they had lived in Depression-era Germany. As weeks turned into months, German POWs faced a profound psychological challenge. Everything they had been taught about America and Americans was proving false. The cognitive dissonance created real mental distress for many prisoners. Hardcore Nazis among the prisoners insisted that the comfortable treatment was a trick, that the Americans were trying to weaken their will and turn them into traitors. These ideologically committed prisoners sometimes terrorized others who expressed doubts about Nazi teachings, creating a dangerous internal dynamic in some camps. There were cases of prisoners being beaten or even killed by other prisoners for being too friendly with guards or expressing admiration for America. But the evidence before their eyes was impossible to ignore completely. The Americans they interacted with daily were not the monsters of propaganda. Many guards were farmers or factory workers in civilian life, ordinary men doing a job. Some spoke German, descendants of German immigrants who had come to America generations earlier. These German Americans embodied a living contradiction to Nazi racial ideology. They were ethnically German but culturally American, and they seemed perfectly content with their identity. They had not been corrupted or weakened by American society. They had prospered. They owned farms, ran businesses, and lived comfortably. The prisoners noticed that these German Americans ate the same food they did, including the ice cream, and thought nothing of it. This was simply normal in America. The propaganda had also told them that America was torn apart by racial hatred and that different ethnic groups were constantly at war with each other. Yet the American soldiers guarding them came from diverse backgrounds: Italian Americans, Polish Americans, Irish Americans, even some African American guards in certain camps. They worked together, ate together, and seemed to get along despite their differences. The reality was more complex than the prisoners could see. America certainly had racial problems, especially regarding African Americans, but the surface impression contradicted the Nazi narrative of a society on the verge of collapse. The prisoners were witnessing a functional, prosperous, multi-ethnic democracy, and it challenged everything they thought they knew about racial purity and national strength. Some prisoners began keeping secret journals, recording their observations and questions. They noted the abundance of food, the relative kindness of guards, the efficiency of American organization, and the wealth visible everywhere they looked. Even in rural camps far from cities, they saw farmers with tractors and trucks, modern equipment that few German farmers could afford. They saw ordinary Americans driving cars, something only the wealthy or party officials did in Germany. The cumulative weight of these observations began to crack the mental walls that propaganda had built. Not all prisoners changed their minds. Some clung to Nazi ideology until the day they died, but many began a process of questioning that would continue for years after the war ended. The ice cream, trivial as it might seem, became a powerful symbol that encapsulated everything confusing and challenging about American captivity. Food historians have noted that ice cream was deeply embedded in American culture by World War II. It was associated with childhood, happiness, prosperity, and leisure. Americans ate ice cream at birthday parties, on hot summer days, and as a simple pleasure. The ability to produce and consume ice cream on a massive scale represented industrial capacity, agricultural abundance, and a standard of living that few other nations could match. When German prisoners ate ice cream daily, they were consuming not just a dessert but a symbol of American power. For many prisoners, ice cream became a way to measure their experience against their expectations. In letters home that passed through censors, prisoners would sometimes mention the food, carefully avoiding details that might seem like they were aiding the enemy but hinting at their good treatment. Families in Germany, receiving these letters, often did not believe them. Surely their sons and husbands were being forced to write positive things to confuse German intelligence. Surely no one was eating that well while Germany starved. The disconnect between prisoner experience and home front reality created its own tragedy. Germans suffering under Allied bombing and Soviet invasion could not imagine that their captured soldiers were eating ice cream in America while they scrambled for scraps. The ice cream also represented something more subtle: American optimism and belief in abundance. Nazi ideology was built on scarcity, the idea that resources were limited and that strong nations must take from weak ones to survive. This zero-sum worldview justified conquest and genocide, but America operated from a different assumption: that productivity and innovation could create abundance, that prosperity did not require conquest. The daily ice cream was a small but powerful demonstration of this alternative worldview. It said without words that there was enough food, enough resources, enough prosperity to go around. For prisoners steeped in Nazi scarcity thinking, this was revelatory. It suggested that the entire basis of their ideology might be flawed, that their nation had gone to war based on false premises about how the world worked. As the war continued, and the number of German POWs in America grew into the hundreds of thousands, the need for their labor became increasingly important. American farms faced severe labor shortages as young men were drafted into the military. The government organized programs that allowed POW labor to be used in agriculture, particularly for harvesting crops. Prisoners were transported under guard to nearby farms where they worked alongside civilian laborers and sometimes even farm families. This direct contact with ordinary Americans provided another layer of reality that contradicted propaganda. Many American farmers, practical people focused on getting crops harvested, treated the German prisoners as simply workers doing a job. There were instances of farmers' wives packing lunches for the POW work crews, including sandwiches, cookies, and yes, sometimes homemade ice cream or other treats. These small acts of ordinary human kindness done without political motivation had profound impacts on prisoners. A sandwich packed by a farmer's wife, given to an enemy soldier working her fields, communicated something that no propaganda could counter. It said that Americans saw Germans as people, not as monsters or subhumans. This recognition of shared humanity was something many prisoners had not felt in years. The work programs also gave prisoners a glimpse of American rural life. They saw how American farms operated, the machinery used, the productivity achieved, and the standard of living farmers enjoyed. Even American farmers, often portrayed in Nazi propaganda as ignorant peasants, lived better than most Germans. They had electricity, indoor plumbing, radios, and automobiles. Their children attended school, sometimes arriving in yellow school buses that fascinated the prisoners. The farms produced more food than the families needed, with surpluses sold to market. This practical demonstration of American agricultural abundance explained where all that ice cream came from. America simply produced more of everything, and the surplus supported both the war effort and the comfortable treatment of prisoners. As the war progressed and Allied victory became certain, American authorities began implementing educational programs in POW camps. These programs, sometimes called re-education, aimed to challenge Nazi ideology and prepare prisoners for eventual return to a democratic Germany. The approach was subtle, not crude propaganda, but rather exposure to information that had been denied to them. Prisoners could watch newsreels showing the true progress of the war, not the distorted versions provided by Nazi media. They could read newspapers and magazines presenting different perspectives. They could attend lectures on democracy, economics, and history that offered alternatives to Nazi narratives. The effectiveness of these programs varied widely. Hardened Nazi believers resisted, dismissing everything as Allied lies. But many prisoners, already questioning due to their treatment and observations, were receptive. They began to learn about the extent of Nazi crimes, information that had been carefully hidden from the German public and military. Many initially refused to believe reports of concentration camps and genocide, dismissing them as wartime propaganda. But as evidence accumulated, including testimony from German civilians and eventually their own observations after the war, denial became harder to maintain. The comfortable treatment they had received in American camps stood in stark contrast to what they learned Nazis had done to prisoners. The comparison was damning. The re-education programs also taught practical skills and democratic principles. Prisoners learned about free elections, freedom of speech, and the rule of law. They studied how democratic governments functioned, how peaceful transitions of power worked, and how citizens held leaders accountable. For men who had grown up under authoritarian rule, first the Weimar Republic struggling with chaos, then Nazi dictatorship, these concepts were largely theoretical. But the Americans guarding them demonstrated these principles in action. Decisions were made through chain of command but with input from lower ranks. Rules were applied consistently, not arbitrarily. Corruption was punished, not ignored. The system was not perfect, but it functioned in ways that totalitarian systems could not match. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, German POWs in America faced a new uncertainty. The war was over, but they could not immediately go home. Germany was destroyed, occupied, divided among the Allies, and facing questions about how to deal with the devastation and crimes of the Nazi regime. Many prisoners wanted desperately to return, worried about family members they had not heard from in months or years. But repatriation was a slow process. complicated by the chaos in Europe and by questions about which prisoners should return first. Those with no Nazi party affiliation and no evidence of war crimes were prioritized, while suspected war criminals were held for investigation. During this waiting period, which lasted months or even years for some prisoners, life in the camps continued much as before. They still ate 3 meals a day, they still had ice cream, they still worked, read, played sports, and waited. But now the conversations changed. Prisoners discussed what they had heard about conditions in Germany, the destruction, the occupation, the hunger. Letters from home when they arrived told of cities in ruins, families homeless, food scarce. The contrast with their own situation became almost unbearable. They were eating well while their families starved. They were safe while their loved ones struggled to survive. Guilt mixed with relief created complicated emotions that many struggled to process. Some prisoners expressed a desire to stay in America rather than return to the ruins of Germany. They had seen American prosperity and freedom firsthand, and they wanted to be part of it. However, immigration laws and public sentiment generally did not favor allowing former enemy soldiers to remain. There were exceptions, prisoners with special skills or those who married American citizens in the years after repatriation, but most eventually returned to Germany. Those who did return carried with them memories and perspectives that set them apart from Germans who had never left. They had seen how the other side lived, and they could not forget it. When German POWs finally returned home, they encountered a Germany that barely resembled the nation they remembered. Cities were rubble, infrastructure destroyed, the population traumatized and desperate. The occupation zones created strange new realities, with different rules and conditions depending on whether your area was controlled by Americans, British, French, or Soviets. Those returning to the Soviet zone faced particular hardships, often being imprisoned again in brutal conditions that made American camps seem like paradise in retrospect. Those returning to Western zones found devastation but also hope, as Marshall Plan aid began flowing and reconstruction slowly started. The returning POWs discovered that their experiences in America were almost impossible to communicate to those who had stayed. When they spoke of eating ice cream daily, of humane treatment, of abundance, many Germans did not believe them or accused them of exaggerating. In a nation where survivors were eating grass soup and sawdust bread, tales of American plenty seemed like cruel fairy tales. Some returnees learned to stay quiet about their captivity, knowing their stories would only create resentment or disbelief. Others became quiet advocates for democracy and reconciliation, having seen that the former enemy was not as monstrous as they had been told. The contrast between treatment in American camps and treatment in Soviet camps became a political issue as the Cold War developed. German POWs held by the Soviets were used as slave labor, worked to death in many cases, and often held for years beyond the war's end. Those who survived Soviet captivity returned physically and psychologically broken. The Germans who had been held in America or Britain told very different stories, creating a stark comparison that influenced West German alignment with the Western Allies. The memory of ice cream and humane treatment, compared against Soviet brutality, helped shape political attitudes in post-war Germany. It was a small factor among many but real nonetheless. For individual former POWs, the experience of American captivity had lifelong effects. Many credited their time in American camps with saving their lives. Had they remained fighting, they likely would have died in the final desperate battles of the war or in the chaotic aftermath. Instead, they survived, well-fed and safe, and were able to return home to rebuild their lives and families. The gratitude some felt was profound and genuine. They named their children after American guards who had been kind to them, sought out pen-pal relationships with Americans after the war, and became advocates for German-American friendship. Others struggled with complex feelings of shame and confusion. They had fought for an evil regime, participated in a war of aggression, and in some cases witnessed or participated in atrocities. The comfortable treatment they received in captivity stood in painful contrast to the suffering they had helped cause. Some dealt with this through denial, continuing to insist that Nazi goals were justified even if methods were flawed. Others experienced genuine transformation, dedicating themselves to ensuring nothing like Nazism ever rose again. They became teachers, activists, and witnesses, using their experiences to educate younger generations about the dangers of totalitarian ideology. The ice cream, strange as it sounds, remained a touchstone memory. In interviews conducted decades later, elderly former POWs would still mention it with wonder. It represented the moment when their worldview cracked, when they first realized that what they had been taught was wrong. Food historians and World War II scholars have collected numerous oral histories where the ice cream comes up repeatedly. It was not that the ice cream itself was so important, but rather what it symbolized. A nation wealthy enough, confident enough, and humane enough to feed its enemies dessert daily was not a nation that fit Nazi propaganda narratives. The simple act of eating ice cream became a moment of clarity that some prisoners carried for the rest of their lives. Understanding why American treatment of German POWs was so humane requires examining both practical considerations and values. The Geneva Conventions of 1929 established international rules for POW treatment, including provisions about food, shelter, medical care, and work. The United States took these obligations seriously, partly from genuine commitment to international law and humanitarian principles, partly from practical concern that American POWs held by Germany should be treated well, and partly from cultural values about proper behavior even toward enemies. American military leadership believed that honorable conduct in war, including humane treatment of prisoners, distinguished civilized nations from barbarians. Germany, despite being a signatory to the Geneva Conventions, followed them selectively. German treatment of British and American POWs was generally acceptable, though conditions worsened as the war turned against Germany and resources became scarce. However, German treatment of Soviet POWs was horrifically brutal, with millions deliberately starved, worked to death, or executed. Nazi racial ideology classified Slavs as subhuman, placing Soviet prisoners outside the moral community deserving humane treatment. This selective application of humanitarian standards revealed the fundamental racism at Nazism's core. The fact that Americans treated German prisoners well, despite knowing about German atrocities, demonstrated a principled commitment to standards of conduct regardless of enemy behavior. The contrast in treatment had strategic implications beyond the immediate moral considerations. Well-treated prisoners were more likely to cooperate, provide intelligence, and cause less trouble in camps. The knowledge that surrender to Americans or British meant survival and decent treatment encouraged German soldiers to give up rather than fight to the death, potentially saving Allied lives. After the war, the memory of humane treatment facilitated reconciliation and West Germany's integration into the Western Alliance. The investment in treating prisoners well paid dividends in ways both immediate and long-term. It was moral behavior that also happened to be strategically smart. The ability to feed German POWs ice cream daily was not just about moral choice but about material capacity. America's geographical isolation from the fighting, its vast agricultural resources, and its industrial capacity created abundance that Europeans, even wealthy Europeans, struggled to imagine. American farms using mechanized equipment and modern techniques produced food surpluses that dwarfed European production. American industry, fully mobilized for war but never bombed or invaded, turned out weapons, vehicles, and supplies in quantities that overwhelmed Axis production. This material superiority was fundamental to Allied victory and also enabled the humane treatment of prisoners. German prisoners working on American farms saw this abundance firsthand. They operated tractors and combines that did the work of dozens of men. They harvested fields that stretched to the horizon, producing yields that German farmers could only dream about. They saw grain elevators, processing facilities, and transportation networks that moved food efficiently from farm to table. The American agricultural system was not just bigger but fundamentally different, organized around productivity, efficiency, and surplus rather than subsistence. This system produced the milk that became the ice cream, and it did so in quantities that allowed for what seemed like waste to efficiency-minded Germans. The industrial capacity that supported ice cream production was equally impressive. Refrigeration equipment, transportation networks capable of maintaining cold chains, and food processing facilities that could turn raw ingredients into finished products on a massive scale. All of this existed in America while Europe's industrial base was being bombed into rubble. Prisoners in camps ate ice cream made in factories, transported in refrigerated trucks, and stored in electric freezers. Every step of this process required infrastructure, energy, and organization that demonstrated American industrial might. The ice cream was not just food. It was a demonstration of systemic superiority that explained why Germany was losing the war. Among the hundreds of thousands of German POWs held in America, individual stories reveal the human dimension of this historical phenomenon. One prisoner, a former schoolteacher drafted into the Wehrmacht and captured in France, kept a secret diary throughout his captivity. He described his first ice cream as a revelation, writing that he had not tasted anything so wonderful since childhood. He detailed his work on a farm in Kansas, his conversations with the farmer's family, and his growing realization that Americans were not his enemies in any meaningful sense. After the war, he returned to Germany and became a teacher again, but he maintained correspondence with the Kansas farmer until both men died decades later. Another prisoner, a committed Nazi Party member and officer, resisted re-education and maintained his ideological beliefs throughout captivity. Yet even he could not deny the quality of treatment he received. In post-war interviews, he admitted that American conduct had been correct and honorable, even while he continued to defend Nazi goals. His story illustrates that not all prisoners were transformed by their experiences, that some maintained their beliefs despite contrary evidence. Yet even this hardliner acknowledged that his treatment had been far better than he expected or than Nazi propaganda had predicted. The ice cream, he said, was real, even if he refused to accept what it represented. A third prisoner, captured in North Africa as a teenager, described his American captivity as the best years of his youth. He learned English, discovered jazz music, and developed a love for America that never faded. He was among those who sought to immigrate after the war, though he was initially denied. Years later, he succeeded in moving to the United States, where he lived out his life as a proud American citizen while maintaining connections to his German heritage. For him, the ice cream was just the beginning of a love affair with American culture and values that defined the rest of his life. His story represents the most positive outcome of the POW experience, a transformation from enemy to friend to citizen. Despite the restrictions of captivity, real cultural exchanges occurred between German prisoners and Americans. Prisoners with artistic or musical talents often performed for guards and sometimes for local communities. German choral singing, a strong cultural tradition, impressed American audiences. Prisoners with craftsmanship skills made intricate carved objects, paintings, or other artworks that they sometimes traded or gave to guards. These creative outputs served multiple purposes, keeping prisoners occupied, providing a sense of purpose, and creating bridges of human connection across the language and cultural barriers. American guards and camp administrators also shared their culture with prisoners. Movies were sometimes shown, giving prisoners exposure to American cinema. Sports competitions, especially soccer matches that guards sometimes joined, created moments of shared activity and even camaraderie. Holidays like Thanksgiving or Christmas saw special meals and celebrations that introduced prisoners to American traditions. The camps were not vacation resorts, security was always present and freedom denied, but within those constraints, human connections formed that transcended the prisoner-guard relationship. Language learning went both directions. German prisoners eager to learn English studied with whatever materials they could access, knowing that English proficiency would be valuable in the post-war world. Some American guards from German-speaking families practiced their German with prisoners, reconnecting with a heritage their immigrant grandparents had brought to America. These language exchanges were practical but also symbolic. Each word learned was a small bridge built between former enemies. By the time prisoners returned home, many could speak at least basic English, a skill that served them well in occupied Germany where American presence was pervasive. The humane treatment of German POWs in America raised then and raises now important questions about justice and proportionality. As the full scale of Nazi atrocities became known, many questioned whether German soldiers deserved such good treatment. The discovery of concentration camps, the evidence of genocide, and the documentation of war crimes created understandable anger and desire for revenge. Why should men who had served Hitler's regime eat ice cream while their victims lay dead in mass graves? The question was and remains morally serious. The answer American authorities gave was that the treatment of prisoners reflected American values, not German behavior. To treat prisoners cruelly would be to descend to the moral level of the Nazis, to become what was being fought against. Maintaining humane standards, even toward enemies who had not maintained them, was seen as essential to preserving American moral integrity. This was not naivety, but rather a principled stand that human rights applied to all humans, even those who had violated the rights of others. The commitment to these principles was tested but largely maintained throughout the war and into the occupation period. That said, distinctions were made. POWs who had committed war crimes or were members of the SS or other specifically criminal organizations were segregated and eventually tried. The humane treatment did not mean impunity for genuine criminals, but the vast majority of German POWs were ordinary soldiers, conscripts who had fought because their nation was at war, not because they personally endorsed Nazi ideology or participated in atrocities. The decision to treat these men humanely, to recognize their humanity despite their national affiliation, was a moral choice that history has generally judged favorably. The ice cream served to these prisoners was not a reward, but rather a commitment to maintain civilized standards regardless of circumstances. As German POWs returned home and Germany began the long process of confronting its Nazi past, the stories from American camps became part of a larger national conversation. West Germany, aligned with the Western Allies and committed to democracy, embraced narratives that emphasized American generosity and the possibility of reconciliation. The contrast between American treatment of German POWs and Soviet treatment became a frequent talking point in Cold War rhetoric. The message was clear: Germany's future lay with the West, with the nations that had fed prisoners ice cream rather than working them to death. East Germany, under Soviet control and communist ideology, had a more complicated relationship with these stories. The regime emphasized the Soviet role in defeating Nazism and downplayed American contributions. Stories of good treatment in American camps did not fit the narrative of Western imperialism that East German propaganda promoted. Former POWs who had been in American camps and returned to the Soviet zone often kept quiet about their experiences, knowing that praise of America was politically dangerous. The ice cream became a symbol that could not be openly discussed in half of Germany, a forbidden memory of an alternative path for German society as a whole. The stories of POW treatment contributed to a broader reckoning with questions of guilt, responsibility, and how to move forward. The young men who returned from American camps had been given time and space to think about these questions in an environment where they were not fighting for survival. Some of the intellectual and moral groundwork for Germany's post-war transformation was laid in those POW camps, as prisoners attended lectures, discussed democracy, and questioned the ideology they had been raised with. The re-education programs were not solely responsible for Germany's democratic transformation, but they contributed to a climate where such transformation was possible. The treatment of German POWs left a lasting legacy in German-American relations that continues to resonate decades later. Many Germans who lived through the post-war period remember American generosity, both in POW camps and in the Marshall Plan aid that rebuilt their country. This memory created a foundation of goodwill that helped maintain the German-American alliance through decades of Cold War and beyond. While more recent generations have more complicated views of America, the older generation retained a sense of gratitude rooted in those experiences. Veterans organizations in both countries have worked to preserve and honor the complex history of World War II, including the POW experience. German veterans groups have sometimes reached out to American veterans groups to thank them for the treatment their members received in captivity. American veteran organizations have welcomed these overtures, recognizing that reconciliation honors the sacrifices of all who served. The ice cream, remembered and retold, becomes part of these reconciliation narratives, a small but powerful symbol of how enemies can become friends when fundamental human dignity is respected. Historians studying World War II and its aftermath increasingly recognize that how wars end shapes what follows as much as how they are fought. The decision to treat German POWs humanely, to feed them ice cream and teach them about democracy rather than seeking revenge, contributed to a post-war order where former enemies could cooperate. The contrast with the aftermath of World War I, where harsh treatment of defeated Germany contributed to resentment that fueled Hitler's rise, was not lost on American policymakers. The ice cream was part of a larger strategy to win the peace, not just the war, and by that measure it was remarkably successful. In the final accounting, the story of German POWs marveling at daily ice cream in American camps is about much more than dessert. It is a story about the power of abundance over scarcity, the strength of principles over expedience, and the possibility of maintaining humanity even in the midst of total war. The German soldiers who surrendered expecting brutal treatment and instead received ice cream experienced a cognitive dissonance so profound that it shook their understanding of the world. For many, it began a process of questioning that led them to reject the ideology they had fought for and embrace democratic values instead. For others, it was simply a strange interlude in a brutal war, memorable but not transformative. But for all of them, it was unforgettable. The decision to treat prisoners humanely was not soft or weak, but rather an expression of confidence and strength. America could afford to feed its enemies ice cream because it had the resources to do so while still fighting and winning the war. It could choose to follow Geneva Conventions even when enemies did not because it believed in the principles those conventions represented, not just their utility. The daily ice cream was a demonstration of everything that made America different from Nazi Germany: its material abundance, its commitment to human dignity, and its belief that even enemies deserved basic decency. These differences were not superficial but fundamental, rooted in contrasting visions of what human society should be. In our current world, where conflicts continue and questions about how to treat enemies and prisoners remain urgent, the story of ice cream in POW camps offers lessons worth remembering. It demonstrates that humane treatment of prisoners is not just morally right but strategically wise, that maintaining one's principles under pressure defines character more than any words, and that small acts of decency can have profound long-term consequences. The German soldiers who returned home carrying memories of American abundance and fair treatment became seeds of reconciliation that helped transform Germany into a democratic ally. The investment in their humane treatment paid dividends that continue to this day. The ice cream, cold and sweet and utterly ordinary to Americans, represented to German prisoners a glimpse of a different world, a world where prosperity was not seized through conquest but created through productivity, where strength did not require cruelty, and where former enemies could become friends. That thousands of German soldiers could not believe ice cream was served daily in American camps tells us everything about the gulf between Nazi ideology and American reality. That they were eventually convinced by the evidence before them, that many changed their views and carried positive memories of American treatment for the rest of their lives, tells us something hopeful about human capacity for growth and change. The ice cream was real, daily, and abundant, and its reality challenged and changed those who received it. In the end, that simple dessert became a small but significant tool in winning not just the war but the peace that followed, proving that sometimes the sweetest victories come in the most unexpected forms, served cold in a prisoner of war camp somewhere in the heartland of America.